2 Samuel chapter 9. We have a lot of people needing prayer right now, so please be praying for all those folks and all the needs that we have as a church family. And you're going to be thankful that you're here tonight. And we mentioned when we were at 2 Samuel 7 that was one of the most important chapters in the Old Testament because it covers the Davidic covenant. And then chapter 8 was important because it showed that God's promises were already coming true and that God's promises will come true for us. 2 Samuel 9 that we're looking at tonight is one of the most inspiring and encouraging chapters in the Old Testament. This is one of my favorite Old Testament Bible studies and stories. I think it will be yours as well. I know that many of you are familiar with it. Hopefully we can show you some new things that you've never thought about before. But this chapter is about a lot of things. It's about extending mercy. It's about covenant faithfulness. It's about promise keeping and incredible grace. And so if that is the thought of our chapter tonight, you can just look at all those things and say, oh, this is going to be good this evening. And, we're going to kind of focus on the grace part throughout. And when we say grace, we think of a lot of things. We say grace at our table before we eat a meal. We always say grace, and we admire those who have physical grace and those who exhibit grace and coordination of movement and athletic ability, and maybe those who are graceful and carry themselves in dignity and elegance and carry themselves with grace. But I know that you're a Wednesday night Bible study crowd. You know the grace. Immediately you hear the grace. You know the definition because you've heard it so often. Unmerited favor. It's what we don't deserve, but God gives it to us anyway, and we could never repay it. We could never give it back, and because God has been so good. Well, we had that Davidic promise in chapter 7. We had the immediate historical fulfillment of God establishing God's kingdom in chapter 8. And now we're going to come to chapter 9, and David's just kind of taking a breather here. And he's looking around at how good things are going and how all the nations around them are subdued now. And he's in a favorable, stabilized position as king. And so he has a little bit of time to think. And he remembers a promise that he made to his great friend Jonathan a long time ago. So what I'd like for you to do, I know we're going to start in 2 Samuel 9. Hold your ribbon there, hold a piece of paper there, hold your prayer sheet there, something, and go back to 1 Samuel chapter 20. 1 Samuel chapter 20. So I want you to just kind of remember through these promises of 1 Samuel, and we're going to read them again together. I know that you're familiar with the promises of David and Jonathan and the promises that David even made to Saul. But I'm just going to give you those chapters. They're up on the screen. You'll be able to follow along. 1 Samuel 20, verse 13 and 14. The Lord do so and much more to Jonathan, but if it please my father to do the evil, then I will show it thee and send thee away that thou mayest go in peace, and the Lord be with thee as he has been with my father. And thou shalt know, not only while yet I live, show me the kindness of the Lord that I die not, but also that thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. And the word I want you to focus on there is the word kindness. We're going to come back to that in a moment. You see the word kindness in verse number 14. You see the word kindness in number 15. And Jonathan knows that one day David will be king. Jonathan should be the king, right? He's heir to the throne. He's the son of Saul, the king. You would normally think that he would be next in line. Here he is standing before someone else, David, who God has said he's going to be the next in line. And Jonathan says, all right, when it happens, when God blesses you, and when you're in charge of the kingdom, show me kindness and show my family kindness. And then in verse 16, Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And so I want you to see that word covenant there because of how important that is. It was their kind of a contract. They went through a ceremony to make this covenant one with the other. And then later on, when David has actually saved Saul's life and didn't take his life when he had the chance, in chapter 24 and beginning in verse 20, this is what Saul says. And now, behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thy hand. Swear now, therefore, unto me by the Lord, that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And so that's the promise. David, verse 22, swears unto Saul, and Saul went home, and David and his men got him into the hold. They continued to hide and be on the run. But these are the promises that had been made. Now, David, at this point where we're at, if you make your way, boom, all the way back to chapter 9, David desires to fulfill that pledge of support he made to Jonathan and Saul. And this chapter is a supreme Israelite example of covenant faithfulness. I told you it's one of the 4 things that this chapter tells us about. And when we think of covenant faithfulness, we think of the covenant that God has now made with us, that we've been grafted into that covenant, and we're a part of the family of God, and God is going to be faithful to that covenant. But here David is. He remembers that covenant he made with Jonathan, and he's basically thinking and saying, I made a promise. I'm going to fulfill that promise. I made a commitment. I am going to keep that commitment. And the keeping of this commitment is really not to David's advantage. It's not to his benefit. The keeping of this commandment goes against the grain of any other regime. When you come as a new king, you eliminate anyone else that is heir to the throne. The Israelites are eventually going to do that, as we saw in the divided kingdom again and again. But the normal path is just to eliminate anyone that might have access to that throne. But David's purpose is not to eliminate his friend's lineage, but to bless his friend. And he wants to fulfill that promise. And so David proves in this chapter to be a man of his word, and he's proving himself worthy to live and reign on the Lord's holy hill and set upon that throne. And he's willing to keep his oath to Jonathan, even if it could risk hurting his own dynasty. He's literally going to show friendliness and kindness. As Jonathan said, show kindness, show kindness. He's going to do that to someone who is a direct heir to the throne of Saul. And so David has said, I want to just show some kindness here. And notice the question he asked as we start in verse number 9. He said, is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness? There's that word again, kindness, for Jonathan's sake. He doesn't say, is there anyone that's worthy? He doesn't say, is there someone that might be qualified? No, the question is unconditional and unqualified. And he said, let's just begin a search. I want to know if there's anyone left that is a part of Jonathan's family, Saul's family. And so in verse 2 and 3, there was in the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. And when they had called him unto David, the king said unto him, art thou Ziba? And he said, thy servant is he. And the king said, is there not yet any of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God unto him? And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan hath yet a son, a direct heir, which is lame on his feet. Now this Ziba, you might want to remember that and put it in your memory breaks for several weeks later. But he was evidently a well-to-do servant of Saul's household. He's believed to manage the former king's estate. And so just try to think about this in your mind. Saul lived about 3 miles from Jerusalem. It's a little bit to the north and also back towards the Mediterranean Sea, toward the west. And this position had probably worked out very well, very lucrative for him. And because Saul's gone, his household's gone, everybody fled, who's going to take care of all Saul's stuff? Well, I happen to be the head servant. I will take care of all of his land. I'll take care of all of his belongings. I'll take care of everything that he has. And this servant was in that position. And this word kindness, that I mentioned in verse number 1, you saw again in verse number 3. David says again, is there somebody I can show kindness to? He's going to say in verse number 7 eventually, I'm going to show you kindness. And I want to spend just a few minutes on that. That word kindness is hesed. And I put up all the definitions for you where you can see it. There's a lot of people that use different definitions that don't always envelop everything. It literally means to show someone favor or a good deed, to be merciful to someone, to show pity to someone. And I don't know who wrote this, but I really like this definition when I was looking up definitions for hesed. And it's wrapping up in itself all the positive attributes of God. You just take all those positive attributes of God, love and faithfulness and mercy and grace and kindness and loyalty, and all those acts of devotion and loving kindness that go beyond the requirement of duty, all the things that what God does to us, right? God shows us loving kindness, grace, mercy, all of those things, and that's loving kindness. That's the kind of kindness that's talked about in this. The person doesn't necessarily deserve it, but I'm going to show them favor. I'm going to do something good for them. And so David is not an enemy of the house of Saul. He is the agent of God's kindness to this family. And so this story, I think you're already kind of beginning to get the idea. It's not just about David's covenant that he made with Jonathan and David's covenant faithfulness. It also represents God's covenant faithfulness to his people. God will keep his promises to man. And so this Hebrew word, hesed, is love that is willing to commit itself to another by making a promise of solemn record. Not only am I willing to do this, I'm willing to go on record. I'm going to make this covenant. I'm going to go through this exercise. In their day, we've talked about covenants before. They would cut up an animal, lay the pieces of the animal, side by side, and they would walk together through the pieces of that animal. I know that sounds a little bit strange to us. It's not the signing of a contract, but basically they're saying, if I break my word, I'm going to be like this animal that we've cut up here. That's what Jonathan and David did, and now David remembers that. And he's going, I made this solemn oath. I want to fulfill that. I want to keep my promise because I loved my friend. It's been 15 to 20 years since David made that promise that we read. I mean, it's been a long time. A lot of things have happened. A lot of things have gone under the bridge since he entered into that covenant with Jonathan. But it's still, to this day, and here we are in 2 Samuel 9, 15, 20 years later, it still directed his actions. I made a promise. I made a covenant. I'm still living by that promise that I made. His solemn word given under a solemn ceremony, under a solemn curse. If you broke that, it constrained him to act with this devoted love. Nothing is said about, I made that promise a long time ago. Nothing is brought up about, the conditions have changed because I am king now, and this guy is a part of the former regiment. And never does he say, that was just a formality. Surely you understand how unwise that was for me to have made that vow, and it would be terrible to keep it now. None of that happens. And here is the power that covenant exercises. The promise made in the past directs the actions of the present. So if you make that promise, if you make that covenant in the past, it directs what you're going to do today. And that's true of God's covenant that he's made with us. It's true of any promise, really, that we should make. And being under covenant with God gives us a firm place to stand. It evokes a sense of security, privilege, wonder. We are the covenant children of God. It's a pretty amazing thing. In a movie Out of Africa, a long time ago, right? Robert Redford said to Meryl Streep concerning marriage, do you think I'll love you even more if there's a piece of paper? In other words, if we get this marriage contract, you really think that's going to make me love you anymore? And will paper make me love you anymore? And that's kind of today's mentality. I don't want to commit to you. Let's just skip the formalities. And the world today misses the point of what a marriage covenant is all about. The covenant made before God doesn't regulate how much love is there in the intensity of that love, but it does regulate the security. I made a commitment. I made a covenant. I made a promise. Because I made the covenant before God, I'm going to keep that promise. The love that truly loves is willing to bind itself. It's willing to make a promise to someone It's willing and gladly obligates itself so that the other person may stand securely in that love. That's what a marriage covenant is all about. Oh, I love you. Why do we need a piece of paper? Because that binds us together. God loves us enough that he has bound us with him by covenant. We're not our own. We belong to him. It's a beautiful thing. So we keep promises. Not because it's easy. Not because it's convenient. It's a matter of our word. It's a matter of our faithfulness. So David says, is there anyone that I can keep this covenant? God's going to keep his promises to us. We should keep all the promises that we've made before God. God is faithful to us. We should be faithful to God. And if you are a Christian, your life consists of covenant obligations because of this promise. I mean, does this story not press upon us the importance of keeping all of our promises, all of our covenants? And so the question of David is, who can I show kindness to? Who can I show hesed to? And they say, oh, there's one, but there's a problem. He's lame on his feet. He's lame on his feet. What happened? Well, when they were fleeing because you became king, and everyone was fleeing in fear because of this new change of the head of government and the new king, and they fled in fear with self-imposed exile. Back in 2 Samuel 4, verse 4, if you'll remember, Jonathan, Saul's son, just a few pages back, but it's been a while. Saul's son had a son that was lame on his feet. He was 5 years old when the tidings came of Saul and Jonathan out of Israel, and his nurse took him up, 5-year-old boy, and fled. And it came to pass as she made haste to flee that he fell. Don't know what all happened, but the broken legs, the broken feet, ankles, whatever happened, he became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. And so he's been living in exile all this time. Just to let you know, we'll see it in a few moments, but he's lived there long enough that he got married eventually. He has a child of his own, so it's been quite some time. And so they say here in 2 Samuel 9, oh yeah, there is someone, it's Jonathan's son, but he's lame. David's response is great. He just moves right on. And it's as if he doesn't even hear the last sentence. He has this one thought on his mind, showing kindness to the house of Jonathan. And where is he? I mean, grace is like that. Grace is unconditional. Grace is unmerited. We don't deserve it. We can't earn it. And the answer comes is that he's in Lodabar. Just give you a few definitions here. The name Lodabar means no pasture. He's on the backside of the desert. He's living where no one wants to live, where you can't even grow grass. And he's out in the desert east of Jordan. And David's, go get him. I want to bring him here. And so in verse number 5, King David sent and fetched him out of the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel from Lodabar. Just a side note, later this Machir is going to become a loyal supporter of David, probably because of this incident partially, in chapter 17, verse 27 through verse 29. But he's going to be faithful supporter of David. Verse number 6, when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was coming to David, he fell on his face and he did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, behold, thy servant. Can you imagine how afraid Mephibosheth must have been? He's finally found me after all these years. This is it. What's going to happen with my wife and my son? Are they going to go after them too? And appropriately and probably awkwardly, because he was lame, he falls before David in honor. And David says in verse 7, fear not. I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. Now, I want you to notice a change here just in our text. This is kind of an extra little thing, and we'll continue in just a minute. But when David is interacting with Ziba, it'll say, and the king said, verse 3, verse number 4, and the king said. When he's interacting with Ziba, it's always the king. He comes to talk to Mephibosheth, verse 6, and David said. Verse 7, and David said. I think it kind of suggests a more personal touch there. I think it's kind of a neat thing. I don't want you to be afraid, Mephibosheth. Because of your dad, I'm going to show you kindness. Everything's going to be okay. First thing he says, I'm going to restore all the land. Whew. Don't miss that. All the land. That land 3 miles north and a little bit to the west. All that land where Saul lived, it's all going to be yours. Immediate riches. You're going to eat at my table. You're going to be where I'm at. You're going to stay here. That was a favor that was extended to David when he was a young boy and he first started going to Saul's house in his youth. Now he returns the favor. Mephibosheth is provided protection at the king's table, provision at the king's table, and position because he's at the king's table. In verse number 8, he bowed himself and said, what is thy servant that thou should look upon such a dead dog as I am? And he feels like he has no reason to be able to come before this, no reason to gain these riches. And the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, I have given unto thy master's son all that pertained to Saul and to all his house. Wow, that's even bigger. Not just all the land. Notice that word all again. I'm going to give you everything that belonged to Saul. Guess who's been living as if this was his? That servant, Ziba. I mean, he's the apparent loser in all of this. He's the one that lost in this deal. But as far as Mephibosheth, everything that Saul had, that is not a small thing. If you get all the land and all the possessions and all the things that belong to a king, wow, that's pretty good for this young man. And he says to Ziba, what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to take care of him. In verse 10, you and your sons and your servants till the land, bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. So Mephibosheth now has 15 sons and 20 servants. That's 35 that are working for him. You take care of him. You bring in the fruit of the land. He's going to be here at my table. That is a point. I mentioned it again because it's mentioned 4 times in the text in verse number 7, verse number 10, verse number 11, verse number 13. And so I also want you to notice that David's promise to Jonathan has gone above and beyond the regular intention. The regular intention is when you're king, don't knock off my family. Oh, not only am I not going to kill your family, I'm going to make your family part of my family. That's above and beyond. So David had kept the promise before that chapter began because he had never sought him out to kill him. But now he makes him a part of his own table. I have given him all that pertained to Saul, while everything that has been lost has been regained. And he's gone beyond just survival out in the place of no pasture to a place of sustenance. And then in verse 11, then said Ziba unto the king, according to all that my lord the king hath commanded his servant, so shall thy servant do. As for, what else could he say? As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table as one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. All that dwell in the house of Ziba were servants unto Mephibosheth. And Micah is going to have 4 sons. But Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he did eat continually at the king's table, and was lame on both his feet. So I want to wrap up this part of the story. We're not done just because we got to verse number 13, but there's 2 elements of Mephibosheth's condition that are emphasized in this last passage. The first is his lameness, his disability. And sadly, that last verse reminds us of that. I don't know why it says it again. We already knew that. But, I mean, he seems to be a helpless, dependent cripple. But the second thing is his hereditary, his heritage. He's a son of Jonathan. and it makes him the grandson of King Saul. He is a part of that previous regime, yet he's spared because of a covenant oath that David had made. And the one who could be considered an enemy of the new regime is now embraced in the safety of this covenant because of the king showing him kindness. Now, because of the promise that David made, a promise that sane politicians and rulers would never have made such a covenant, Mephibosheth is safe, he's secure, he's sheltered in the kindness of Hesed. So I want you to picture for just a second before we get to the practical application of this for us is what life would have been like for Mephibosheth in the years to come at the king's table. You know, it's time for supper, the dinner bell rings. Ammon comes in, he's clever, he's witty. Joab comes in, he's muscular, masculine, hard, skin baked by the sun. Probably a few scars. Absalom comes in, just a vision of charisma, right? Personality, not a blemish in sight. Long hair flowing, he's proud of it. Tamar, she's beautiful and tender. Solomon is probably a little late, not paying attention, coming in maybe reading a book or something, studious. And then comes Mephibosheth. Shuffling in, maybe needs help, but finally takes his place at the king's table besides the king's sons, seated by the king, near the king, at the same table. And once seated at the table, the tablecloth of grace covers his legs and his feet, and everyone at the table is on the same level. So I want you to see the application of all this for us today and where we're at. At one point, Mephibosheth enjoyed uninterrupted fellowship with his father. His father was a good man, Jonathan. By the time we pick up his story, though, things have already turned tragic. There's a fall. The fall came. The disaster would leave him crippled for life. We think of us being crippled in sin. Because of that sin and because of our original fall, we're enemies of the kingdom of God. We are at enmity with God, as it says in Romans chapter 5 and verse number 10, in Romans chapter 8 and verse number 7. No one is further from the kingdom than us. We have been crippled by sin all of our life. David comes along and out of sheer kindness to Jonathan's handicapped son, he shows him that love and grace, and God, out of his love and grace, sent his only son to pay our debt, and God willingly extends his grace to every believing sinner. We had nothing to offer. We deserved nothing. We could not repay our debt, but God came seeking us. He takes us as we are, where we are, unconditionally, unqualified. God says, I'll accept you by grace. David restored Mephibosheth from a place of barrenness to a place of honor. He brought him into the place of plenty, seated at his table, and God has taken us where we were and brought us to where he is, the place of fellowship that he once enjoyed with Adam. We come back into his presence boldly. David adopted Mephibosheth into his family. He became one of the king's sons, so to speak. And we, though once in sin, are now brought into the family of God. We have become the sons of God. Our disabilities are all just a reminder of his grace. And we're brought to the table of grace. Can you imagine what it'll be like at the marriage supper of the Lamb of God, seated at the king's table? We are God's Mephibosheths. We have, because of that, the security of the covenant, the assurity of God's promise, There's absolutely no reason we should be seated at the king's table. It makes no sense. God's love to us is unexpected. It's incredible. It's grace. So have you become so used to this story that it no longer causes you to be amazed? Are you so familiar with it and become maybe so comfortable at the table that you no longer realize the undeserved privilege that we have to come into God's presence? May we never become so accustomed to God's grace that it ceases to be amazing. God gives us his protection, and at God's table we have that protection, we have that provision, we have that position. Because of Hesed, we have security and sustenance and significance and safety and shelter. All of those promises that God has provided for us. And God will keep his promise. We can count on it. When everyone to bow with heads bowed, eyes closed. Father, we do thank you for this great story of Mephibosheth. This is just such a beautiful story. And Lord, help us to see ourselves as we are before you. Nothing to offer, nothing to give. But in kindness, you still love us, and you bring us into the family. It's enough that you just deliver us from the penalty of death, but you go beyond that, and you make us a part of the family. It's just unfathomable. What great blessing we have because we're your children. And Lord, because we're your children, we feel comfortable bringing before you our needs, our concerns, our worries for our family. And Lord, all four of these ladies, that their husbands